Hi everyone and welcome to my coverage of round 9 from the World Chess Championships 2013 between Anand and Carlsen. With only 4 games remaining and trailing 5-3, the pressure and the onus was on Anand to try something in this game, his penultimate game with the white pieces. For the first time we saw him open with d4, because he played king's pawn in all of his other games with white. So the big question for the spectators was, what did Vishy have up his sleeve in terms of preparation, and also what had Carlsen's as yet anonymous team prepared against d4? Most were happy to see knight f6, which implied one of the Indian openings, and indeed that's what we saw. After c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop b4, with a Nimzo Indian, one of the most respected answers to the queen's pawn opening at the top level. Black is playing to control the e4 square, with his knight eyeing it and his bishop controlling the only piece that's controlling e4. And you know, in most lines Black will voluntarily give up the bishop pair in order to damage the white pawn structure with bishop takes c3. And this is going to give him counterplay against the double pawns, and generally he'll try and keep the position relatively closed for his knights, and white will try and open it up for his bishops. So it's a very strategical opening and leads to games of a distinct kind of character. There are of course many lines from this position, and Anand continued here with f3, going into the Simish variation. The idea of course is to play e4 and gain a powerful pawn center, similarly to the Simish variation of the King's Indian with f3 and e4. It makes positional sense because Black is playing to control the e4 square, and this move challenges it in a very direct way. But it does have drawbacks in that it does nothing for White's development, which will be clumsy on the king's side as a result of this move. So we saw one of the main lines. Black fights hard to keep control of e4 with d5. And after a3, he continues with his strategy in accordance with the previous play. Bishop takes c3 check. So b takes c3, and now Black can strike immediately at the white center with c5. Playing instead d takes c4 gives White exactly what he wants after e4 with this really great center, and threatens bishop takes c4 to win the pawn back straight away. If b5, a4, and if c6, then bishop a3, with full compensation, if not more, already for the pawn. So c5, and now c takes d5. And this too is the main line. White liquidates his double pawns, but he frees Black's light squared bishop in the process after e takes d5. He's opening the position, which should favor the bishops, as I said. Playing instead d takes c5 gives White little here. There's no way to hold on to the pawn anyway, and Black doesn't even lose time winning it back because he can attack it with tempo, and you know, while developing for the most part. So c takes d5 anyway. Now e takes d5 and e3. So Black has been successful in controlling e4, and now came an interesting moment because we got to see Carlsen's preparation. Here he played c4 because his d pawn is weak here, so you know, White may have played d takes c5 later in order to attack it more easily, and it can become, you know, a target in end games and middle games and so on. And now that option is ruled out, and White is posed with the question of how to develop in a harmonious way. However, on the flip side, this clarifies the central tension and makes White's e4 push easier and safer to play. It's not a well-known line, but it has been played before many times. Botvinnik beat Capablanca in a famous game that featured a very similar setup, and Kasparov beat Judith Polgar with it as well. So it's a great recommendation for the white side because both of those victories were with the white pieces. Both players were familiar with the position when talking about it in the press conference anyway, so they're not strangers to what's going on here, of course. Anand continued with knight e2, and he has a sharp idea in mind with this move that we'll get to in a moment. So knight c6, and we can see that from the opening, the exchanges that have taken place, this b3 square has been weakened. And after c4 has been played, it's very hard for white to stop this knight getting to b3. And this is what Carlsen really is aiming for with his opening choice and subsequent play on the queen side. So now g4. This is the last book move in my database, and it's the sharp move that I referred to a moment ago. So this move is about the struggle for e4. This knight is going to be kicked, and then white can play e4. And it's a very double-edged choice because he has to weaken his position considerably to do it. And it was fantastic to see Vishy throwing down the gauntlet to Carlsen, and clearly out for blood given the match situation. He's 2 games behind, 4 games left, he has to try something, and this is it. So Polgar, in her game against Kasparov, made the mistake of playing h6 in order to prevent this push, and something that Kasparov was able to directly refute later in the game. So Carlsen castled instead, and Anand answered bishop g2. This gives further support to the e4 push, and this is a natural development given white's position. He also wants to aim for this weak d5 pawn in the longer run. So Carlsen answered with knight a5. Some people were talking about sacks on g4 here, but they just don't really do anything at all, so there's not really much point even going into them. So Anand castled, and now knight b3, and the point of this move is that the rook is going to have to move now, obviously, and this gives black the option later of taking on c1 and trying to attack e3, or plant a piece here, or just create play against it. So Anand played the same way as Kasparov with the rook a2 as opposed to rook b1, and from here the rook is open to swing over to the king side and participate in any attack on that side of the board. And Anand knows these theoretical positions like the back of his hand. These were his great strength in his younger career when he first became part of the chess elite, so he knows exactly what's going on here. So Carlsen now started his queenside initiative immediately with b5, and Anand answered knight g3. Another of the reasons of playing an early g4 is so the pawn isn't blocked by the knight that's going to be staying on the square for the middle game. Supporting e4, it can jump to the king side, and theory has dictated that this is the correct square for the knight. And it's really clear that Anand is going for the jugular right out of the opening, so great to see, as I said. So Carlsen continued on the queen side a5. He has a pawn majority here, so it makes sense for him to try and attack and create something in that area of the board where he's strong. So g5. Anand continues with his sharp plan of playing e4, first by kicking the knight, and then continuing with e4. And in fact, he could have played e4 straight away here with a temporary pawn sacrifice. Play e4, and if d takes e4, now bishop g5, with knight e4 coming next. And black doesn't want to play h6 here under any circumstances, so this leads to very sharp play. For example, e3 could be played here. It's not advisable to open up the f file. So now knight e4 in a very sharp position, but of course black doesn't have to play d takes e4 to allow this position, but these are some of the ideas that can come into the position from where we were. So g5 anyway. Now knight e8, and Carlsen preferred this square to d7, and it's a better choice positionally. We'll see why a little bit later. So e4, Anand continues with his aggressive play. This move has the benefit also of defending the g5 pawn with the bishop. It's attacked by the queen. And if knight takes c1, queen takes c1, which is what we saw in the game. And now a nice move from Carlsen. Rook a6. It's a multi-purpose move. It allows black to play b4, and after the a pawns are traded, the rook isn't going to be hanging on a8, and it also gives the king side an extra layer of defense on the third rank. So it's a dynamic choice from Carlsen, and it doesn't 100% look it right now, but the position is already approaching critical If black doesn't take extreme care, he can get blown out of the water here on the king side. There are some very potent attacking ideas, and it's really great aggressive play from Anand. Presumably he'd seen that he must take his chance in this game. So here he continued with e5, gaining space with the idea of playing f4, f5 and storming the black kings, creating huge pressure on Carlsen's position. Kasparov was watching this game, and he gave the interesting alternative rook b2 at this point, attacking b5 and slowing down black considerably on the queen side. The engines like this move a lot, and I played out a sample line with Fritz 12 playing against itself, which went as follows: rook b6 and now e5, and here h6, which is a move I'm not sure a grandmaster would play, but Fritz seemed to think it was fine at depth 25, so I'm not going to disagree with it. F4 is what it gave us the way to continue. If instead g takes h6, rook takes h6 is the move, dropping b5, but now queen h4. It's going to get the pawn back with some pressure, and this is exactly what white should avoid with the strategy he's chosen of attacking on the king side. In no situation does he want to allow the black pieces to swoop in on these weaknesses here. He has to keep control if he's going to play this strategy of marching up with his pawns. So after h6, f4 would be the move. So knight c7. This is how the sample line went. Now h4, hg5, fg5. It's unorthodox play, capturing away from the center, but very strong. And you know, after, for example, b4, c takes b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, black should in theory be able to get this pawn back. I think the idea is just to vacate the b4 square for the knight, so it can attack this weakened d4 pawn. So for example, queen e7, now knight h5 with a very dangerous threat of knight f6 check. Black has to play accurately here. Queen d7 is best. If he clumsily plays something like bishop b7 for example instead, then knight f6 check, king f8 is forced. If instead g takes f6, g takes f6, attacking the queen and threatening queen g5, and mate is going to win. It's going to have to sack everything to stop the mate. Even then, mate's just delayed. You know, it's absolutely hopeless. So king h8 would be forced, and now queen d1, and the threat is queen h5, and again mate. So g6 and now h5, and black is just getting hacked apart here. White has an advantage of over 4 pawns, so it's winning, and this is the kind of danger that black has to take great care to avoid in this position. So instead of allowing knight f6 check, after knight h5, as I said, queen d7, and now bishop f3, and here a sequence is kind of hard to understand if you're not a computer. Queen h3, it's kind of engine-minded. I'm not going to go to great lengths exploring the reasoning behind each move. Suffice to say that after the continuation, queen e3, queen f5, knight f4, queen d7, now h5, queen d8 to attack g5, g6, bishop f5, g takes f7, rook takes f7, rook g2, and white is just gonna mow black down here. King h8 and bishop g4, bishop b4. This is the line I looked at earlier, and now e6, and white just has a crushing advantage of over 2 pawns here. So it appears Kasparov's judgment was correct, and this is precisely the kind of winning attack that white can create with his king-size space that he gains through advancing his pawns there. But it's an extremely risky approach. If the position destabilizes elsewhere on the board, it can often mean that you paid a price for weakening your king-side defense. Okay, so we can return to the actual game now. Anand played e5. So Carlsen continued with knight c7, overprotecting d5 and preparing for knight b5 to intensify the pressure after b4. So you imagine b4, knight b5, there's pressure on c3 and on a3. And it also gives extra options regarding how to recapture the rook after b4 and the exchange of the a pawns. So f4 is what Anand played. He's continuing with his plan of f4 and f5 and then f6, and a similar attack in mind to that which we've seen already. So b4, and you know, Carlsen knows very well that he must create play on this half of the board. If he has no threats to make, then he's just going to get blown out of the water on the king side. With this play, he can utilize his pawn majority, which by extension will help in his defensive task to a degree. Anand now answered with a takes b4. Although he didn't have to, White's position on the king side is so strong that he can just play f5 here, as recommended by GM Geary on Twitter. As before, Black has to defend with great accuracy in order to survive here. g6 is the best. If he rushes on the queen side with something like knight b5, he gets into trouble. After a takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes a6, bishop takes a6, and now f6. He can let c3 go. Knight takes c3, f takes g7, and king takes g7 is forced. If the rook moves, then queen f4 is a win. For example, rook e8, queen f4, threatening queen f7. It's mate, so queen e7, and now queen h4. And the idea is play knight h5, f6, and mate on h7. So for example, queen e6, knight h5, and to stop the mate, queen g6 is forced. This is just dropping the rook, but black has no choice. Knight f6 check, king takes g7, knight takes e8 check, with a fairly simple win for white. So king takes g7 is forced. Now queen f4 is still good. King g8, queen h4 with the same idea is virtually winning for white. Knight e2 check is forced at this moment in order to prevent the attack. Just dropping the knight for nothing, just to stop it coming to h5. So knight takes e2, but white has, black has these connected pass pawns as compensation for the knight. So c3, king f2, bishop takes e2, king takes e2, queen a5 is best, and white is still significantly ahead after queen f4, despite these connected pass pawns, which usually would be better than a piece. So queen f4, the idea is to play bishop h3 and then e6, or bishop h3 to f5 and attacking on h7. And these plans will be faster than black's initiative on the queen side. For example, b3, bishop h3, queen a6 check, king f2, c2, bishop f5, and now rook c8. It's a sneaky move. White's best is rook c1 here. If bishop takes c8, queen takes f1 check, king takes f1, and now b2 is an amazing winning line. It's a full queen and bishop down, but the connected pass pawns win it. So rook c1 would be better. And now b2, this is the best option that black has. So rook takes c2, and now more sneakiness. Queen f1 check, king g3. If instead king takes f1, b1 queen, king f2, rook takes c2, bishop takes c2, queen takes c2, and maybe black can draw from here. So king g3, and now queen g1 check, king h3, rook takes c2, bishop takes c2, b1 queen, bishop takes, queen takes. And again, you know, black is going to have a tough time of it here, but there may be some kind of drawing resource. However, it's probably still a win for white. So this illustrates the care that black and both sides really must take in these lines. So you know, that's if black rushes with knight b5. After f5 in Geary's line, the correct move, as I said, is g6. And then, you know, play might continue. A takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes a6, knight takes a6, f6. However, it seems that even on the greatest depth, there is not a direct and winning line for white from this position after queen d7. But as before, great care is required, and black has to find these only moves. So, very, very critical and sharp position with extreme accuracy required. So, what actually happened in the game was A takes b4 is what Anand played. So A takes b4, rook takes b6, knight takes a6. A forcing line, and now Anand can continue with his plan. f5. At this point, the commentators reported that there was great cheering in the studio, with all of the Indian people seeing their great champion Anand attacking so fearlessly. It should be noted too that white doesn't want to play c takes b4 here, because then knight takes b4 and the knight is coming to d3. It's a very powerful square. So Carlsen thought for a while, and as we've seen, there are all kinds of attacking ideas for white here on the king side. Once he'd calculated as deeply as possible, he played his move b3. And indeed, the engines also prefer this over making some kind of defensive move, such as g6, or that kind of thing. And this passed pawn is pretty much black's only claim to anything in the position. His pieces are totally out of play and inactive. Moreover, he's faced with the charge of the light brigade on his king side. These pawns plowing down are extremely dangerous, and it was very, very tense, the atmosphere at the board, with both players fully aware of how critical and razor sharp the position was and had been for many moves, never mind the fact that the world title was on the line. So Anand continued now with queen f4, and he's got the same idea in mind that we've seen in previous variations, queen h4, f6, and so on, and using the knight and the rook to deliver mate. So knight c7 from Carlsen. He gets his knight back into the game. So Anand played f6 now, and Carlsen answered g6, which makes clear the squares that he'll need to defend, as opposed to complicating things with g takes f6. Although that is also playable, but the position becomes fixed after g6, the move that Carlsen played, and this makes it more concrete and easier to defend. So queen h4, and here Anand has a simple plan of playing queen h6 and rook f4 at h4, forcing mate. So black's response is forced. Knight e8. All of his pieces on the back rank. As knight e8 is to defend g7. Anything else loses because white gains a tempo after queen h6, because of the threat of queen g7 to play rook f4 and then h4, and that's going to win. The fact that he wins the tempo. For example, if bishop d7 here, queen h6, knight e8 to defend. Now rook f4, b2, rook h4, and there's no way to stop the mates. If the pawn queen, simply knight f1, and no sacrifices are working to prevent the mate or anything like that, even with two queens on the board. If the knight sacks on f6, then after taking the mate on g7 is also threatened. So white just wins from this position. So knight e8, the only move to save the game from Carlsen. So the right move, obviously. And now queen h6 from Anand, still with the same idea. And now again the only move to hold the balance for Carlsen was played, b2. So Anand now thought for over 40 minutes. Given the position, there are of course great precautions that need to be made to ensure you've got your calculations right. Feeling confident that he had, Anand played the move that the engines recommend, the incredible rook f4, allowing Carlsen to queen with check. So what a position. I think it's been quite a while since we had 3 queens on the board in a World Championship match. Amazingly enough, given the threats on the black king, this is still an objectively equal position. However, after spending 40 minutes thinking, Anand now played the incorrect defensive move, knight f1, because he had a concrete idea in mind that we can see in a moment. But this is a huge blunder, and it loses white the game. He had to play instead bishop f1, where the only move for black to avoid getting mated is queen d1. so that after rook h4, in turn the only move for white to hold the balance, because it forces queen h5 to avoid the mate. And now comes, of course, knight takes h5, g takes h5, rook takes h5. Initially, Anand had considered bishop h3 here, with the idea of stopping the bishop coming to f5, which is the way to stop the mate after rook takes h5. But after bishop takes h3, rook takes h3, comes queen b6. And after rook takes h5, queen b1 check, king g2, queen g6. And black still doesn't get mated. So it was at this moment that he, when he realized this didn't work, that Anand came up with his second flawed line with knight f1 and a combinative idea that we'll see in a second. But to go back to what we were looking at, knight takes h5, g takes h5, rook takes h5, and so not bishop h5, not bishop h3, sorry, instead of rook h5. Bishop f5 is forced now to stop the mate, and now best play goes bishop h3 to distract the bishop from defending the mate. But of course black doesn't fall for that, and he plays bishop g6, where the line that the players discussed after the game was e6, the only move to keep the balance, threatening e7, forking the queen, and threatening queen takes f8, which is mate. And now black gives back the piece with knight takes f6, g takes f6, queen takes f6, where the line they gave went rook e5, f takes e6, now queen e3. And white quickly makes sure he doesn't get mated, and their feeling was that white should be able to hold this position despite being the pawn down. However, after Anand's blunder knight f1, Carlsen found the winning move, which was queen e1. And here Anand resigned on the spot, because now if rook h4, just queen takes h4, and he's a rook down and unable to make further threats on the black king. In playing knight f1, he realized as he took his hand off the piece that he'd opened the e1 to h4 diagonal, allowing Carlsen this game-saving move. Now none of the attacking ideas will work for white, so he has no choice but to resign. What he'd expected in his analysis was queen d1 instead of queen e1, queen d1, where he'd planned a very nice line. After rook h4, queen h5, rook takes h5, g takes h5, and now knight e3. And white has sacrificed a rook, but there's no way that black can allow the knight to come to e7, or it's going to be game over. So he's going to have to give up his queen, because this move attacks d5 with two pieces. So for example, bishop e6, and now bishop takes d5, and black has to play queen takes d5 here, dropping the queen and going into a lost game. The point is that if bishop takes d5, now knight f5, and there's no defense for black. For example, if bishop e6, knight e7 check, and if king h8, queen takes f8 is mate. So queen takes e7 is forced here. Now f takes e7 as now knight g7, because queen takes f8 was again threatened, and now e takes f8 and king takes f8 with an easy win for white. But unfortunately for Vishy, he'd missed this move, queen e1. So it was an amazing game. Without doubt the sharpest of the match, and credit has to be given to Anand for taking the risk when the time and the situation called for it. But unfortunately it's backfired, and now Carlsen needs only one draw from the 3 remaining games to become world champion. Surely at this point the result is beyond question, but fate can be a fickle mistress at the best of times, and nerves are bound to come into the question as well. In the press conference, when asked if Carlsen was scared at all during this game, he said he was, virtually all the way through, given the mate threats, which is the first time he's had to face his king getting mated in the match. But he said he calculated as well as he could. He didn't find any winning line for white. So as long as he knew that, he knew he was okay, and it was just a great performance from Magnus and an aesthetic final position with 3 queens on the board. It's quite something to note as well that Carlsen won this game without moving either his c8 bishop or his queen, that started the game on d8. So it's just incredible stuff. So I'll be tuning in tomorrow for what could be the game that creates a new champion. I hope to see you there, and also that you enjoyed the analysis. I'll be back tomorrow with the next game anyway. Whatever happens, it's sure to be an exciting round. Thanks very much.